Hi, thank you for the introduction. My name is Phoebe, and I'm here to talk about our recent work on understanding how people make and share passwords. Systems generally assume that only one person knows the password to a given account. But in practice, we know that this isn't always the case. Case in point, I have access to my relative's Hulu account. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room that does this. Indeed, password sharing has become more openly talked about in recent years, especially in the context of online streaming accounts. However, beyond just streaming accounts, existing work has highlighted how users share passwords in a wide variety of contexts and for a wide variety of reasons, such as for convenience, as in the case of family members and couples who share utilities accounts, for financial reasons, whether it be save or manage money, or for work, in order for organizations to share resources within members. Indeed, for these users, convenience and in some cases necessity of password sharing in the present outweighs potential security risks that to them may or may not actualize in the future. So what do we do about password sharing if it's not going anywhere soon? For one, we can understand how people make these shared passwords in order to tailor security advice and work towards safer sharing practices. And to do this, we ask a few research questions. First, who makes these shared passwords? Is it an individual coming up with the password? Is it a group effort between multiple users? And so on. And then, how do these password makers make the passwords? Do they follow similar strategies that have been highlighted in the context of single-user password creation? Do they do something different? And then finally, are these shared passwords reused, and in what contexts are they reused? Are they reused in other shared accounts with personal accounts? And to answer these questions, we built an online survey, and we recruited 300 participants from a US Census representative sample through Prolific. And I would like to highlight that because we do look at password sharing through a US-centric lens, prior works have highlighted how device and account sharing varies heavily across cultures, so our results would look different if repeated in a different cultural context. And then also in our survey, we did not directly ask participants for their passwords, so we can't evaluate the security of these passwords, only the methods used to generate them. So I'll quickly talk about the structure of our survey. So first we ask participants to give us a very broad overview of the accounts they share. How many accounts do you share? Who do you share it with? How many people do you share it with? And what types of accounts are these, like streaming accounts, bank accounts, etc. And then of this broad overview of accounts, tell us in depth about 3 of your accounts, about who made the password. If you made the password, what influenced you to choose this particular password, and other security behaviors. And then for a point of comparison, we ask similar questions of accounts our participants do not share. And from there, we compare and contrast their password creation strategies. So before I answer our research questions, I'll give a quick overview of our participants and the accounts they share. So by far the most commonly shared accounts were streaming accounts, shared by over 90% of our participants, followed by shopping accounts, and then financial accounts. And the median participant shared 3 accounts with others, and accounts were typically shared with romantic partners, with children and parents, and the median account had 3 users, including the participant using it. So that brings us to the next question. Who's making these passwords? By far, most commonly, it was a single person in charge of making passwords. Collaboration and even using a password generator to create these shared passwords were relatively rare. So that begs the question, who are these individuals making passwords? Most often, it was the account owner, who our participants defined as someone who pays for the account for subscription accounts, or someone who originally created the account in the first place. And the main takeaway here is that non-owners are rarely directly involved in the password making process. Now, speaking of the password making process, what are these password makers doing? Are they different from single user accounts? Well, very similar strategies are employed by our participants for both accounts they share and do not share. And one of the main pressure participants talked about was just having too many passwords and dealing with it by creating more memorable passwords, incorporating meaningful information passwords, or reusing passwords, all strategies that have been highlighted by prior works in single-user password creation. So you might be asking, what's different? Well, in addition to prioritizing usability for themselves, our participants also talked about prioritizing usability of passwords for other users. And this is often talked about in the case of people sharing with especially old or especially young users. For example, one of our participants shared a shopping account and said, security was mildly important, but mostly I wanted an older, not so computer-savvy relative to be able to enter it correctly. And in addition, speaking of usability, there's another pressure that we think might influence password creation is we ask participants, okay, for these passwords you share, how did you give them to the other users, or how did you receive them? And most of our participants talked about the verbal component of transferring passwords, which is most common, followed by using email and text. So we theorize that the verbal component might impact how shared passwords are composed, but we'll need to dig into this further. And now I'd like to talk quickly about the origins of these shared accounts. So we asked our participants, for these accounts you share, were they always shared, or did they start as individual accounts that you later started sharing? And these two cases were actually about equally as frequent, accounts that were not made with the intention of sharing that later became shared, and accounts that were always intended to be shared. And for these initially personal accounts we asked, did you update the password when you started sharing it? And in a vast majority of the cases, these participants did not change the password when they started sharing it with someone. This is worrisome and potentially problematic given what we know about how users tend to reuse passwords. And speaking of reuse, now we ask, okay, for these accounts you share, where do you reuse these passwords and where? So for a majority of these surveyed accounts, there is no reuse, but for about a third of them, participants reported reusing this password elsewhere. And that actually represents about 43% of our participants. So where are these passwords being reused? Well, it was about equally frequent that our participants talked about reusing passwords with other shared accounts, but also with personal accounts that they don't intend to share with others. And I would like to talk about the reuse with other shared accounts. A lot of our participants talked about having family passwords, or where they have the same password for all the accounts they share with the same group of people to make access easier for one another. So what do we do about password sharing beyond telling users, hey, stop reusing your passwords? We talk about a few solutions in our paper, but for the talk, I'd like to focus on one user-side solution that came up in our participant responses, which was using password managers. So a very small portion, but not 0% of our participants talked about using password managers to generate and safely share passwords with their family members. And I'm interested in finding out the usability of these. We already know that password managers do have some usability challenges, but I'm interested in usability of sharing features specifically. And then one theme I'd like to highlight from our responses was that our participants rely on trust to maintain security of these shared accounts. These accounts are typically shared with parents, spouses, and children, people that ideally you trust not to try to break into your bank account using your Netflix password. And prior works have highlighted the difficulties in untangling accounts when couples break up, for instance. I'm also interested in the future of what happens to shared account management when relationships don't necessarily end, but just change, like in the case of kids that move out, and what happens to shared accounts then? Speaking as someone who moved out 10 years ago and has access to way too many of my parents' accounts. So enough about what we still want to know about shared passwords. In summary, shared password creation is often an individual effort with very rare instances of collaboration, but still other users influence the composition of these passwords through usability concerns. And password reuse was commonly reported for participants across both shared account context and personal account context. My contact info is here. I'm happy to take questions.